I think Oregon's going to beat Ohio State in Eugene.
Okay, this needs to stop.
I think Oregon matches up with Ohio State, and I think if you match up with Ohio State, you match up with everybody.
Year 3 for Oregon under Dan Lanning. The Ducks' first year in the Big Ten might be his best season yet, and it might be the year that Dan Lanning leads Oregon to their first ever national title.
What exactly am I talking about?
I think that Dan Lanning and Oregon get over the hump and win a national title.
Dan Lanning raises the college football playoff trophy January 20, 2025. So the Oregon Ducks win the national championship this year.
Still Flockin says Oregon wins their first college football national championship and becomes the first 16-0 team in college football history.
Foot race to their sideline. Touchdown, Oregon!
Ladies and gentlemen, children of all wages, welcome to Get Ducked, the podcast that covers Oregon football and probably basketball, but we don't know yet because it depends on time and money. So go ahead and like and subscribe to this channel. It is the SDP Studios YouTube page and the SDP Sports department of that page. Also, go ahead and move on over to SDP Sean Doesn't Play, the video game channel that is the also another subsidiary. Go ahead, like, subscribe, and recommend me a video game to play where I'll play it poorly. Right now, it's going to be NCAA Football 2014 and also College Football 25 for now. But literally any game on the planet, go ahead and recommend that, and I will play it. It can be Red Dead Redemption, it could be Halo, Call of Duty. I don't know what new games do they have now that I can be even worse at as well. Excuse me. Now, let's talk about the top of the show and what I am sort of referring to. As a Duck fan, I am always... I'm not necessarily a cynical or jaded fan, but again, as someone who wants to see the play on the field and see how it goes on the field, and we see the results that way, I hope for the best and expect the worst. And that could just be how it usually plays out in terms of how things have played out over the years for the team. But I think that's just sort of the mindset that you're supposed to have when you're playing in athletics, and knowing that any given Saturday or any given Sunday or any given day that you're playing the game, you could lose or win no matter how good or bad you are. And I think a lot of this has to do, first of all, sportscasters are a lot like youth pastors. Well, where they will lead off something that sounds crazy. So, they'll say, LeBron James is the worst basketball player of all time. And then they sit there and pause, and they're like, they wait for you to be like, what the heck is he talking about? Now, granted, LeBron James is, there's debate on whether he's the best of all time, but certainly not the worst. And then they're like, hear me out. Just hear me out. And then they go on and explain some sort of thing that is relevant to why they sort of said something super hot and crazy and controversial right off the bat. LeBron James is the worst basketball player of all time if it was played on Mars. Now, hear me out. Like, they'll do that kind of cadence. And so I give a lot of those guys sort of the benefit of the doubt that they're pulling that dumb bull crap on it. But I think a lot of this has to do, and with guys like Colin Cowherd, he's a Northwest guy. He's Washington, originally from Washington, and he doesn't have the worst sports takes in the world. So, I think he comes from a decent enough place that he's not, super biased or anything, but in the sense that he's not the worst out there, I guess, in terms of sportscasters. And his take on the matchup between Oregon and Ohio State this year isn't the worst. All the stars are kind of, situationally are aligning in the sense that, Oregon did last time they met up with Ohio State. Oregon beat them in the shoe, and that's a big deal, big time. And especially when Ohio State has had, Oregon's number over the course of the decades. And, a lot of that did have to do with the fact that Oregon has been, sort of a mediocre program, except maybe, until about 1998, 1999, with a few or a couple bad years in between. But before that, they were not great. And man, I'm out of breath for some reason. Did go on another jog today, but let's just take a deep breath. Anyway, Ohio State is one of those blue bloods, like every year they're a contender, except for, sometimes an exceptionally bad year. And sometimes you can sort of see those bad years coming, it's a rebuilding year. They lost an amazing roster, and they, they're all going to the pros, and they haven't really replenished or developed their new talent yet in a new roster. So it'll be sort of a rebuilding year for them. But most of the time, they're usually in the conversation, at least for, top 7 teams, let's say. For Oregon, that used to be sort of an aberration, or, something on the outlier, that they would have like a top 5 year. I think before 2006, they had maybe 2 seasons where they were in the top 5 at best. I think in 2000, the Joey Harrington years, they were, ended the AP polls or whatever at like number 3 in 2000, and then like number 2 in 2001 after they won the Fiesta Bowl. But it's only till recently, and I think historically, it was only until recently that there was any sort of idea that Oregon was in any way sort of a contender talk every year. And I think that really, really took off in 2010-2011 season, their first time that they went to the national championship game. And I think you'll get perspective just listening to this right here.
38 seconds, and Thomas takes the snap, and the field is rushed by players, and the fans want to come out but won't be able to, but they'll celebrate in the stands as the team heads down to the end zone. And fans everywhere, 114 years they've waited, 10 seconds on the clock. And Oregon is going to play in the national championship game. 2-1. It's official. Oregon is going to be in the BCS championship game. Can you believe the magical season this has become? And it's not over. Oregon and their fans, their team, the band, all down in the corner of the end zone, celebrating, congratulating each other, and living in the moment. And somewhere down in that humanity, a soaking wet Chip Kelly is talking to the media about his team and what they have accomplished. Unbelievable to have been a part of this. Oh my gosh.
That honestly is probably one of, if not, that call from Jerry Allen is definitely number 2 on the top 2, just because it probably goes behind the pick. And the pick is going to be hard to beat. But just think about that, though. How many generations have passed? 114 years that the program had been around at that time, and now it's what? Almost 140 years or whatever now since then. 114 plus 50, about 125-ish or so. This might be the 125th year. And they, just the emotion that comes from as a broadcaster, because he's also a fan, that something that fans in the 70s, 80s, 90s never thought would happen. They never even, they were so bad. Like, the team was that bad. And they, it was a good year if they went to any bowl game, really. They could have gone, to the Funyuns Bowl, and that would have been a huge deal. And so, that, though, was the season, they just barely missed winning the national championship that year, by a last-second field goal. And it was about then that suddenly, you're hearing the jokes like, oh, the O stands for zero championships, ha ha ha. Before that year, no one was counting how many championships that Oregon had. And now they are, because, in the conversation, every year now, it was a conversation, except for, the low points, or the low years, the 2 low years or whatever that they had with Mark Helfrich. And even before that, they went to the national championship again, and they lost with a greater deficit than they did against Auburn in 2011. But since then, that was sort of the thing. And I think that, despite people sort of thinking the Ducks are just kind of new blood and, not that great of a team or whatever, or, all flash, all style, whatever, I think people started looking at them a little closer, and especially because before 2011, there were 2 near misses. There was the Joey Harrington senior year where people kind of thought that they should have been there instead of Nebraska, especially after Nebraska got pounded in the national championship game, and that was just a hot year for them. And then 2007, people thought they were legitimate contenders, and then Dennis Dixon goes out with an ACL tear that kind of stopped the season short. But in 2011, they actually made it to the game. And so people were like, oh, wow, this could be legit. And I don't think, unfortunately, this speculation and hyping is not going to stop maybe until they actually win one. And I think a lot of that has to do, like I mentioned before, that Colin Cowherd's a northwestern sort of, or northwest sort of native, and or at least he grew up there. And so, even though it's Washington or whatever, Washington State that he grew up in, there's still some sort of, enough of an allegiance to the Pacific Northwest. And I think, though, that now that people are sort of counting the Ducks and how many national championships they win and seeing kind of their progression over the years, I think people are sort of rooting for them. And if you're an Oregon State fan or, sort of any other fan on the West Coast, maybe not so, but there's a contingent of people that are rooting for this team in the sense of like, man, it's kind of like the rest of the country in the Detroit Lions. They're like, man, I kind of want to see them succeed because they had been bad for so long. And with the Ducks, it's been that it's not necessarily been that they've been bad for so long. They had been before, but now they're finding themselves with 20 plus years of pretty darn good success. And, a few years ago, they finally won their first Rose Bowl. And then after, had some BCS wins in the meantime. And then before that, the Fiesta Bowl in the early 2000s, so on and so forth. And the Rose Bowl, though, was kind of their next big hump, because they never won it before. And then they finally won it, and then they won it again. And they were kind of leaders of the Pac-12 and Pac-10 for so long, even with losing Rose Bowls and stuff in that meantime, and then eventually finally winning them. But then they have that hump now of the national championship and the national championship game. They've gone twice. And then there were some near misses. Like last year, you could sort of argue that they were contenders and Lanning and the squad just couldn't get over the Washington hump. That's a big monkey on his back that Lanning has right now. He really needs to figure out a way to beat Washington. And I know that Kalen DeBoer is gone and is in Alabama, but again, the teams are going to be, they're going to present, the team's going to still be kind of a monkey on his back. I mean, it's sort of the same thing we talked about last episode of teams like Stanford and Arizona State or Washington State even, that, and then Oregon State, every once in a while, that even if they're bad, they're still sort of a threat. And they're a threat in the way that maybe a trap game or something, because, the Ducks now have a target on their back, and now they have to sort of play like the big dog and not the underdog. And I think that sometimes they weren't really familiar with that. And that's sort of the reason why, though, I also think they haven't really gone anywhere in terms of winning the national championship, because both times that they went, they were sort of happy to be there. And I kind of give them the benefit of the doubt in the first one, but ironically, that was the one they were most competitive in. The second one, they've been there before. Now it's time to get over that hump and actually win the game. And they fell even shorter. So, but I think that people are sort of rooting for them. So they'll overvalue the team in terms of like, oh my gosh, they're going to win it this year. Oh my gosh, they're going to win it this year. And like I said before, earlier, there is a chance because Oregon has had the best roster that they've had this year probably. And they had a weaker roster a couple years ago, and they went on and beat Ohio State in the shoe. And that's a big deal because Ohio State is a tough team no matter what. Even if they're having a bad year, they're a tough team. And they weren't necessarily that untough of a team. I think that year it was C.J. Stroud was the quarterback. And it was maybe his freshman year, but, I mean, it's C.J. Stroud. So we arguably had a weaker roster, and we have a much stronger roster now. And now, since it's an in-conference game, you can't play on a neutral site, or it doesn't necessarily have to be an away game for the Ducks, and it's in Autzen. And Autzen has the nickname where good teams go to die. And they sort of get that name for a reason. So the circumstances would imply that, okay, the Ducks do have a good chance of beating Ohio State. But again, that's really all you can say. All you can really say is, there's a really good chance that they might win. But again, the game is played on the field. And you have to know that Ohio State's not going to come in just being like, okay, well, since they said it, okay, it's going to happen. And I think, though, that people are so eager for the Ducks to not only consistently get big wins, because despite popular belief, they're not necessarily all the time choke artists, okay? They've won big games and they've beat big teams. Like I said, Ohio State in the shoe. And they've played competitively with large programs that are blue bloods in big games, and they didn't quite get blown out all the time. Or they've won. So, the whole choke artist thing isn't always necessarily true. But I think though that the fact that a lot of this stuff is now realistic in terms of the ability to win big games and make the big game and maybe even win the big game, that everyone's trying to jump on the bandwagon, and not necessarily the bandwagon, but they're trying to say, oh my God, they might actually be able to win. And sure, I'm not necessarily denying that they could win, but again, the results are on the field. But people are jumping the gun in terms of this is the year. And that very phrase, "this is the year," is sort of indicative, I think, of the mindset of people. Even people like Colin Cowherd and the other pundits out there, I think they're very eager to sort of see that, people like Alabama and LSU or like those type of blue blood teams, they don't really take too kindly to new blood coming in and being successful. But I think a lot of times though, people are just very eager to see Oregon finally win the big one, especially since in previous decades or previous eras, it hasn't always been the case that was even a possibility whatsoever. And now it's like it's so close you can taste it. And I'm one of those people that's like, yes, I want it just as bad as you. But again, it's just like, I'm not so sure. I'm not sure yet. And I'm not even saying I'm not sure yet, like it won't happen or I'm certain of it. But I'm not there to make that wild prediction, that wild jump, that wild speculation that it is going to happen. I think the burden of proof is more on the people that are going to say it's going to happen than it's not. And again, it's not because I'm being cynical or jaded about it or whatever. I want it to happen, and I want it to happen sort of more than anyone you could ever really imagine. But again, it's just like you got to look at it sort of realistically. There are other teams that are gunning for that position, and they're going to play their tails off to make it happen too. I mean, Ohio State, they don't want to get embarrassed in Autzen or not win the national championship. So, and then you have other teams like Alabama, and you have teams like Michigan, and you have teams like that. So it's just you don't know. And granted, again, this is probably the best roster that Oregon's ever had. And it's getting better. And, we'll get into recruiting news maybe later. That honestly, the recruiting for Oregon has been so news-breaking and skyrocketed within the past few years that it's going to be hard to keep up. It's going to be a sort of a full-time job to sort of keep up. I think people's worries about the sort of slow time of recruiting for Oregon, I think, is over. And in 2025 and 2026, it's looking pretty good. The Ducks have sort of stacked their special positions like receiver and quarterback. The quarterback room is pretty deep coming next year. I mean, you have Gabriel's leaving, but then you have Dante Moore, and then you have Austin Novosad, and then you have Achilles Smith Jr. coming in. Amongst, I think, a couple other quarterbacks, but I forget their names. And then you have Gatlin Bear that's going to be there. I think he's a 5-star. He'll be there after his mission is over as a Mormon or whatever. And then you have the current crop of like 4 and 5 stars that have been picked up last year and this year. You have people that are freshmen and stuff that are coming in. The running back room is pretty deep too. So I think a lot of that was the Ducks sort of kind of getting everyone that they already sort of needed to get and didn't really have a need for anyone else. But now they're looking at, I think, a 4 and 5 star O-lineman, and we'll go ahead and get back to that in the future. But they're sort of building their team in the trenches again. Of course, this last year they focused a lot on the defensive side of things, so they were sort of replenishing and improving on defensive back positions. They feel like they're pretty good at linebacker, it seems like, because they haven't really been gunning for a lot of linebackers necessarily. And then, of course, the D-line and all the recruits that they made this year for the defensive line. So I think that lull period of the recruiting was more just like they're sort of an embarrassment of riches right now, where I think they've sort of recruited everyone out of high school that they could recruit up until the point now that they can focus on maybe some non-special position players and pick up people in the trenches, and then see kind of what goes on in the future in the transfer portal, because that now is a big recruiting sort of apparatus as well. So I think it's okay, and I think it's going. So the roster is going to get better, or continue to build at least in that trajectory. But yeah. So again, I'm not really a fan of the big predictions, and I think it's okay to have an opinion on who you think might win. But I think to say it with a lot of certainty and sort of in the sportscastery type of way, you could say like, look, I've done certain research or whatever, and I've sort of seen that the situation is playing at odds and whatever. I think Oregon has a very good chance at beating Ohio State. But to kind of go and say like, I think they're going to win, or statements like that, it's kind of just worthless. What's the prediction going to really do? That video immediately ages the second that the team that you predicted to win loses, or the team that you predict to lose wins. And especially if you go all the way down to the granular of predicting scores, and it's like, okay, you're probably going to be wrong on the score. And even if you're right at that point, you get like 1 minute to say like, cool, I guessed it right, woohoo. And then the rest of the time, though, you got it wrong. So it's like, it doesn't even matter. So I think, though, going into it, you could say, certain teams have good chances of winning. And, at this point, it's true. I mean, the only team that can really beat Oregon is beating Oregon, or is Oregon beating Oregon. It's always mental. You could have the other team that's playing their tail off, and they do beat you. But a lot of times it is sort of mental, or a mental thing. And, there's always talk and speculation. I've even seen stuff of being like, Oregon might go undefeated this year and just come right in and win the Big Ten. You just don't know that. And there are teams, there are teams you don't know about, like I've said before. Maybe you'll get to know them in the future. But for now, it's like you just kind of got to take every game for what it is. And I think that should be the approach if you do want to do something like win the national championship. I mean, that's the old Chip Kelly adage: win the day. Just play every game like it's your Super Bowl. And that should be sort of the approach. I think it's like Moby Dick, Captain Ahab is trying to chase that white whale, and he wants that white whale so bad. He's looking too far ahead that he ends up not getting the whale. And right now, this is Oregon's white whale, is the national championship. And so I'm just going to pull up my phone real quick, because I am going to go kind of through the schedule and not sort of to sit here and talk about, oh, they're going to win this game, oh, they're going to lose this game, but sort of, kind of. And I'm only going to, it's going to be with a bit of a caveat. The caveat is that it's more to say, like, look out for these games that could be trap games. And the Oregon news is just moving so fast. I'm going to try to keep up. We'll get to news later. But a lot of this, again, is sort of cultural and mindset things that have to do with the team. So we're just 2 weeks away, less than 2 weeks away from kickoff. So that's exciting. Very exciting time. Austin is going to be alive and kicking. Excuse me. Oh, man. All right. So, first game of the season against Idaho. Now, Idaho has been historically not great, to put it nicely. Let me adjust the light here. I'm so sorry. Whoops. There we go. That's a little better. I feel like I looked a little washed there, but so Idaho has historically been not fantastic. I sort of have a soft spot for Idaho. I like their little stadium. It looks kind of cool. It's very like if a high school team had a dome, and that's not an insult, I swear. So, of course, being AP top 20 or AP top 3, number 3 pick, you should think that they should win. And it's going to be likely they will, just based on the history of both programs. The next game, though, is really what I want to move to, is Boise State versus Oregon. And this one is at Austin this time. And normally, Oregon had played Boise State, I think maybe once at home, but largely it's been at Boise State. But Boise State, again, no matter what year it is, no matter how strong their roster might be, no matter what superstar quarterback they might have, they're always just that weird team that's a threat. And they could beat you any day. And Oregon, historically as a program, has had a bit of a monkey on their back when it comes to Boise State. I mean, we all know the infamous LeGarrette Blount punch game at I think it's Albertsons, like the grocery store, Albertsons Stadium, I think. Maybe not now. It's probably some big, like, BlackRock corporate, BlackRock Stadium. But I think at the time it was Albertsons. But it was at Boise State. And people thought Oregon was going to win that game. They were finally going to beat Boise State because I think Boise State had beat them once before. But they didn't. Boise State had stonewalled the blistering offense of Oregon. And people had thought Oregon will finally get over that hump. And I think since then, we haven't really played them. So we haven't really had that chance to sort of get that, exercise that demon. And so that could very much be a trap game for sure. The thing is, I think with Oregon, especially this year too, is like, again, they just, it's been like that before, but for sure this year, especially with all the hype built up, unfortunately, like I said, I don't like that. I don't like all the hype. Not because I don't like the team, but again, we have to even the best teams still kind of act like they're not as good as they are, or they're underdogs because of that reason. And then they have success. So really, it's sort of a Pascal's wager, if you will, because it's like you don't gain anything from having all the. I mean, look at Colorado last year; they went 4-8, and they had all this hype behind them. And Oregon was sort of the first line in the process of them being humbled. So it doesn't really pay off to think you're really as good as you are, and it pays off more to kind of think you're not as good as you are, and then be that good or even better. So they should sort of approach every team, especially the good teams, but look at those trap games and then play those trap games like the other team should be winning, and you're the one upsetting them. So Boise State, I think, is still one of those teams. You got to look out for them. And that's week 2. So it's like even though the playoff has been extended to 12 teams, any loss really could throw you off on your season. It's kind of funny too, because the 14 playoff was sort of a way to mitigate the BCS system, because a lot of teams were getting shafted, but it sort of just kind of shafted teams in a different way. And personally, I think that Oregon was sort of the reason for the playoff being created, actually, and the BCS system being complained about on a large scale. I know there are other teams that had issues with it, but I think, honestly, Oregon was sort of the ones that it became a very big topic of discussion. I can go deeper into that in a future show. But anyway, and then week 3, we have Oregon State, which, of course, due to the collapse of the Pac-12 and people like DJ, was it Ukulele? I'm usually pretty good with Hawaiian names because my dad lived in Hawaii for a while, so the names and stuff weren't super unfamiliar, but, oh wait, Uiagalelei, that's right. I just couldn't really picture the name in my head. But anyway, he left for Florida State, transferred out. He was supposed to be kind of the star QB when he transferred into Oregon, and they were building the roster around him. But of course, with the collapse of the Pac-12, the team is very depleted now, roster-wise. And whatever conference they sort of end in, if it's a Power 5, they'll probably be at the bottom. And despite my bias against Oregon State, I do sort of feel bad about that. And this is just coming from a typical and with Jonathan Smith leaving to Michigan State too, that's a big deal as well. I think if the Pac-12 didn't collapse, Jonathan Smith never would have left, and the team would have been built much better than it was. But I think Jonathan unfortunately dipped when he saw the writing on the wall. So that is a problem for Oregon State. And so they're out of coach. They, of course, they obviously have a new coach, but they're out their former star quarterback turned head coach, hometown hero, and then their star quarterback leaves. And I'm sure there's, I haven't really followed that news very much, but I'm sure there's plenty of other players that sort of followed suit, also seeing the writing on the wall. So their roster is very depleted, probably not that great. And they would probably be an average Mountain West team at best right now, Group of 5 conference, and probably the bottom of a Power 5 conference if they ever end up in that. Unfortunately, I think they're still stuck on the gambler's fallacy, the sunk cost fallacy, along with Washington State, that they're just going to definitely completely go down with the Pac-2 ship, and in hopes that it'll be rebuilt. But unfortunately, without any major changes and moves, I don't think the Pac-12 will be the way it was ever again, even if they get 12 teams to join the conference. But it's a rivalry game. It's played at Reser this year. Again, there's the petty bitterness within the Oregon State world, and especially with the collapse of the Pac-12, this could still be very much a trap game. Oregon State at this point is in a place where they pretty much have everything to gain from being the season spoilers. It's like the Little Giants. Wasn't that the Little Giants? What he said at the end there? He was like, oh, wait, no, I think it was an American Dad episode, actually, where Roger tells Steve, it's like, our team sucks and we're not going to the championship, but we have the chance to be a spoiler. Basically that terrible team that hits their stride for one game and beats the good team that has a chance to win the championship, but they get knocked out because they got upset by the bad team. So I do not, again, Oregon State has all the motivation and ability to carry out an upset of that sort. So I still consider them a major trap game as well. And then immediately we go to UCLA, which is the first conference game of the season. I don't know much about UCLA, and Oregon's program has changed a lot. I don't think the Chip Kelly factor will be a big issue in terms of Chip Kelly sort of knowing the sort of the program. Obviously, he's familiar with it in the sense of he probably knows where to go to the bathroom if he found himself in the facilities in Eugene ever. But, there was, 3-4 coaching changes in between the time he left. There was Helfrich, there was Taggart, and Cristobal, and then now Lanning. So, and Lanning, of course, brings his philosophy and his scheme from the SEC in Georgia. So I don't think anything like that would really present an issue. However, it could still be a tough enough game. Of course, always, again, the results are found on the field. But I don't think Chip Kelly has really progressed things to the way that I think maybe UCLA was hoping it would be at this point. I know there was this one defensive end. I can't remember his name right now. Excuse me. You can go ahead and leave a comment if you remember his name. He was a very good defensive end, very good pass rusher. So they have pieces of their team that can present problems, even on the defense. because Chip Kelly had sort of left his defense to the experts. I think because of the things he learned at Oregon. So, again, I necessarily wouldn't count them out, but it's going to likely, look all right for Oregon to be a win. Now, with Michigan State, again, it's kind of a down year, but Jonathan Smith is now the head coach. So usually with new coaches, there's a lot of excitement behind it, a lot of energy behind the squad. So Jonathan Smith is familiar with how to beat Oregon and Dan Lanning because they did it in 2022 in the Civil War with the Beavers. So Jonathan Smith has a scheme, and now he's in a conference and with a program, that has some history to it. Michigan State has been a pretty good program over the years. And Oregon has had a pretty good record against Michigan State. But again, with this team, it could present another trap game that anything is possible because now you have someone that has moved over from being a rival with Oregon. So they're, Oregon State, former Oregon State coach is now Michigan State. So, and he apparently knew enough to on how to beat Oregon because he was able to beat them. So, again, that could present a problem. So there's already 2 or 3 games that are an issue before we even get to Ohio State. And then after Michigan State, it's Ohio State. So already the first half of the season seems to be a relatively grueling schedule in terms of potential losses, honestly, or at least trap games that can give them a scare. And so it's a number 2 and a number 3 matchup. Ohio State's number 2. So this is not a down year for Ohio State. Even you can argue Ohio State had a down year with Oregon when they lost to Oregon in the shoe. And they're a different team from even then. So they're not as young and inexperienced as they were then, and they have a better roster. So even though it's in Oregon or at Autzen, and Oregon has a great squad, and Dan Lanning is building something great, this is going to be a matchup that will probably determine the season probably more for Oregon than it will for Ohio State. Ohio State can probably take this loss, even if it is to Oregon, because they'll likely be the team that beats up on everyone else, and if anything, they might see Oregon again in the conference championship game, or it's likely. So Oregon has a lot more to lose with winning this game or with losing this game than Ohio State does. So even though it's at Autzen and Oregon has a better roster and Oregon's being built like an SEC team, you just never know. And this one is a very key game. Ohio State could be on their game this time. The next game is Purdue. Oregon beat Purdue last time they played them at Autzen. I was at that game. But again, it was down to defensive pick sixes and turnovers and stuff. Oregon kind of had a rough game that game. And Purdue has been known to be sort of an upset machine. I think it was a couple years ago they beat like number 1 Ohio State or something like that. There was some team in the Big Ten that they played like Ohio State that they beat them up pretty. They actually blew them out. And so Purdue is a dangerous team. They always fly under the radar in that sense. And they're always down for upsets. Again, Illinois might be not much of an issue, but again, any given Saturday. Michigan, they're probably down because they're out Jim Harbaugh, and they lost a lot of seniors and stuff. But they're back-to-back national champions at this point. Wow, popping peas. Look at that. Okay. They're down. They're down in ways, but they're still number 9 in the country in the AP preseason polling. So there doesn't seem to be a whole lot that Michigan is really missing out on. And of course, Oregon has had a great history in terms of beating Michigan. Even when they were the extreme underdogs, they beat them in the Big House. It was called the blowout in the Big House. That was Oregon, and they beat them in Autzen as well. And they beat them pretty handily, I think, then, or at least handily enough where it wasn't really a close game and came down to the last second. So again, those are back to back. So after like 3 potential trap games, they have back-to-back games against Ohio State, who's number 2 in the country, and everyone's sort of probably saying they're going to be the national champions this year. And then you have Michigan, who are back-to-back national championships, where their down year is being number 9 in the country. That's a pretty darn good down year, if you ask me. Wisconsin, again, another team that no matter what they're ranked, they could always beat you. And it's at Camp Randall, and so that place is always popping, always bumping, and it's going to be a tough game because it's going to be in November and mid-November, and so it's probably going to be a cold one. Granted, with the Ducks in Oregon, the weather is enough of a factor that I think a lot of Big Ten fans kind of underestimate Oregon being able to handle difficult weather. It's not like it's in LA. Like you can say that maybe about USC, but not so much about Oregon. Oregon in general doesn't have the most harsh weather, but it gets cold and rainy there. So it's like, okay, what's a little bit of snow? But Wisconsin has been kind of 1-for-1 with Oregon. They beat them in 2000. And Oregon got their revenge in 2001 and beat them, but and they played a tough game in the Rose Bowl that Oregon ended up winning. But so they're a good team that could also present another trap, big time. So what's this, like 4 in a row or whatever, or at least 4 out of 6, excluding Purdue and Illinois, or not even Purdue, but Illinois. And then we have Washington finally on November 30th. The last conference game of the season, and just as big of a rivalry, if not a bigger rivalry, than the Civil War. I would say just as big because I think the Civil War, when I grew up, was sort of a more important game. Even no matter what kind of year you had, you wanted to be able to tell your friends who were Beaver fans next to you that you beat them and were better than them. And Washington obviously has had Oregon's number the past couple years, especially, or Dan Lanning's number in particular. 3 losses in a row, 2 last year alone. The one in the Pac-12 championship that basically decided who was going to the national championship. Again, as you saw last year, after the loss to Washington the first time, where I sort of watched that with Akili Smith, sort of unintentionally, but all year last year after that loss to Washington, everyone was like, Oregon should have won that game. It was a small miss. Next time, though, we're going to shellac Washington. It's over. And the Ducks are going to go to the national championship, and they're actually going to win it this time. And I think Oregon probably would have done okay against Michigan. I don't know if they would have won, but the problem is they didn't get past Washington. Washington was on a date with destiny last year, and even though Oregon fought them really hard and they basically came down to last second plays both games, they couldn't get over that hump, and they're going to have to do that. And Washington has taken quite the tumble this year. They lost all their NFL caliber receivers and their NFL caliber quarterback and their head coach to Alabama. So you'd think that this would be a win. But again, it's a rivalry game, and even though it's at Autzen, there's still a lot on the table to be done, to have figured out. My camera battery died. Maybe this is the time to say goodbye. I guess with that being said, since my camera died is telling me it's over, I'm going to continue this on enough to say to like and subscribe to the show. And again, follow that and subscribe to the Sean Doesn't Play video game channel. And go ahead and throw comments in there. Tell me what you think. And just thank you for watching. And I'll see you again in the near future, obviously, hopefully. And yeah, go Ducks.